12 inches by 8 inches. That's the size of the mark a pathologist found on the back of Nolan Wells's head. Not a bruise you'd see just by looking. Something buried deep in the tissue, found only when someone finally cut in and looked. Nobody can say for certain what caused it. For 18 days, this case ran entirely on memory and dispute. Who said what? Who's lying? What a blurry video might show. Today, for the first time, it ran on something else. An actual body. An actual finding. A pathologist saying, in careful clinical language, that he cannot rule out foul play. Welcome to True Crime Site. Here's what the independent autopsy in the Nolan Wells case actually found, and what it still can't tell us. Crump didn't deliver those findings quietly. He stood at the podium of the 117th Knock-Up National Convention in a packed room in Chicago, Nolan's parents beside him, and the Knock-Up's own national president standing right there too. Nothing about that was accidental. This family has leaned the same direction from nearly the beginning of this case. Visibility over quiet channels, public pressure over waiting patiently for local officials to move on their own. Today was simply the loudest version of that instinct yet. The man whose findings were actually being read wasn't in the room himself. Dr. Roger Mitchell examined Nolan's body back on July 10th, 6 days after he disappeared, 4 days after his body was pulled from the water off Horn Island. He's board certified and he holds a national leadership role most people outside medicine have never heard of, heading up the country's longest-running professional group for black doctors. Christine and Elmore had said from early on exactly what they were looking for in an independent examiner. Someone with zero ties to Mississippi law enforcement. Someone whose conclusions nobody could wave away as friendly to local officials. Flown in from outside the state, paid for entirely by an outside donor, answering to nobody connected to this investigation, Mitchell checks that box about as cleanly as it's possible to check it. Here's something worth being precise about, because it shapes everything that follows. Crump wasn't speaking his own words up there. He was reading Mitchell's, straight off the page, in the pathologist's own clinical language. Crump is a lawyer, not a doctor. He didn't write these findings. He delivered them. That became its own small controversy later in the day. A coroner reviewing the press conference afterward pointed out that having an attorney narrate a medical report out loud, rather than the pathologist himself, risks losing precision somewhere in translation. It's worth keeping that in mind for everything that follows, since every quote from this report passed through one more set of hands before it reached the public. At the back of Nolan's skull, in the deep, soft tissue, Mitchell found something he couldn't explain. A discoloration, deep red, roughly 12 inches by 8. That's not a small mark. That's an area covering a real portion of the back of someone's head. Here's what it wasn't. There was no fracture underneath it. No break in the skin above it. On its own, without more information, a finding like that could mean almost anything. An impact, blood settling after death depending on how the body was positioned, even changes from decomposition itself. Mitchell didn't claim to know which. He documented that it exists, flagged it as significant, and left the cause listed as unknown. The body itself made this harder than it should have been. By the time Mitchell examined it on July 10th, Nolan had already been in and out of the water for days. Decomposition had set in enough that ordinary bruising, the kind you'd normally spot just by looking at skin, may not have been visible anymore even if it had been there. That's part of why Mitchell went further than a standard exam. He dissected areas most autopsies wouldn't touch a second time, the back of the head and neck. The ribs, the deep tissue along the back, the arms, the legs, all of it, specifically to rule out blunt force trauma the surface alone could no longer show. Almost everywhere he looked, he found nothing. No other fractures anywhere on Nolan's body. No other deep tissue injuries. Which is exactly why this one finding stands out the way it does. It isn't part of a pattern of injuries across his whole body. It's a single, specific, isolated area, large, unexplained, and something nobody could have seen in any earlier examination, because nobody had dissected that exact spot before Mitchell did. That last part matters more than it might sound like it does. This wasn't a finding the state's own medical examiner missed through carelessness. It's a finding that physically couldn't have existed in their report, because the state autopsy never went that deep into that specific area in the first place. Two different examinations, looking at two different depths of the same body, were always going to produce two different pictures. This is the first place where that gap actually shows up in something concrete. A coroner reviewing these findings publicly offered her own read on what this specific kind of mark can suggest. Discoloration this focused, this measurable, in that specific location, she said, is consistent with a blow to the back of the head, not proof of one, consistent with one. She was also direct about something worth sitting with. Bruising, in the medical sense, generally doesn't form after someone has died. If this discoloration reflects a genuine antemortem injury, something that happened while Nolan was still alive, that pushes the window of whatever caused it back to some time before he entered the water, not after. That same coroner didn't stop at the medical finding itself. She raised something sharper about how this entire process unfolded. In her view, this family should have been offered the option of an independent autopsy from the very beginning, before the state ever touched the body, rather than being left to commission a second, more limited exam afterward. Her reasoning was straightforward. Certain structures only exist to examine once. Once the state's office retained them, no second pathologist, however qualified, could fully recover what an earlier, unobstructed look might have shown. She called the lack of communication about what had been retained, and why, a real transparency problem, not just an inconvenient technicality. That's one interpretation, offered by one medical professional reviewing a preliminary report from the outside. It isn't confirmed by Mitchell's own report, which stops short of assigning a cause at all. Both things can be true at once. A real, documented, measurable finding, and a genuine, unresolved question about what actually produced it. Here's the honest complication running underneath all of this. Nobody currently examining Nolan's body has full information. Mitchell worked without certain structures the state had already retained. The state, for its part, examined the body earlier, before this level of decomposition had set in, when surface bruising might still have been visible, but didn't perform the deeper dissection that would have found this specific mark in the first place. Neither side has the complete picture on its own. Each one is holding half of something that only makes full sense put together. That's the real shape of where this case stands after today. Not a single dramatic answer. A concrete, physical, unresolved lead, sitting exactly where two separate examinations, working from two separate approaches, happen to overlap. There's one detail in Mitchell's report that matters more than almost anything else in it, and it isn't about what he found. It's about what he never had the chance to look at. When Nolan's body reached Mitchell in Washington, it arrived without certain structures from the neck, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone. If that last name doesn't mean much on its own, here's why it should. The hyoid is a small U-shaped bone that sits in the neck, and it's one of the specific things forensic pathologists check when they're trying to determine whether strangulation played any role in a death. A fractured hyoid is one of the clearest, most recognized indicators in that kind of examination. It's not a minor structure. In cases where the manner of death is genuinely in question, it's often one of the first things a pathologist wants direct access to. Here's why that specific bone matters clinically. The neck holds a set of muscles pathologists call the strap muscles, and when someone has been strangled or struck in that area, those muscles can show bleeding underneath the surface, sometimes alongside something called petechiae, tiny burst blood vessels that show up when pressure cuts off blood flow. Checking the hyoid itself for a fracture is a separate, complementary step in that same process. Without the bone in hand, Mitchell couldn't run either check. Mitchell never got that access. Those structures had already been retained by the state's medical examiner before his exam ever took place. It's worth being fair about what that actually means, because retaining tissue after an initial autopsy isn't unusual or automatically suspicious on its own. Medical examiners hold back organs and structures for further testing all the time, and it's considered standard forensic practice. The real issue here isn't that the state kept those structures. It's the sequence. Nobody told Mitchell what had been retained or why before he began his own exam, and nobody told the family either, according to Crump. A second, independent pathologist arrived to do his job without knowing in advance that a piece of what he needed to examine had already been taken out of reach. A coroner reviewing this case afterward put it plainly. If those pieces were going to be held back, the independent examiner should have known that from the very beginning, and so should the family. Instead, Mitchell discovered the gap only once the body was already in front of him. Because of that gap, Mitchell said something specific and careful in his report. A posterior neck dissection performed without the ability to review those anterior structures is, in his words, incomplete. And because of that incompleteness, he wrote that he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to, or a cause of, Nolan's death. That sentence has done more to drive public reaction to this report than almost anything else in it, and it's worth being precise about exactly what it does and doesn't say. Mitchell is not saying he found evidence of strangulation. He's saying he was never given the opportunity to check for it in the first place, using the exact structures built specifically for that kind of check. Those are two very different statements, even though they can sound almost identical when repeated quickly in a headline. There's a second, quieter gap sitting alongside that one. Mitchell's report also couldn't determine whether Nolan experienced any intracranial hemorrhaging, bleeding inside the skull, the kind of finding that would carry real weight given the unexplained discoloration already found at the back of his head. That's not a separate mystery from the one already discussed. It's the same open question, approached from a different angle, and it's one more piece of information the state's earlier, more complete access to the body might have been able to answer. Think about what all of this actually means for the investigation going forward. It's not that a test was run and came back inconclusive, it's that the test was never able to happen at all on this exam with this examiner because the material needed for it was already gone before he arrived. That's not a dead end, it's an open door. If the state allows Mitchell to review its own findings, its own photographs, whatever it observed about those structures before retaining them, that specific unanswered question could still get resolved. Right now, nobody outside the state's own office has been given that access. That's exactly what Crump asked for directly at the press conference. Not a demand that the state change its conclusions. A request that the state let Mitchell see what it already has. Its photographs. Its notes. Whatever it documented about Nolan's neck and skull before those structures were removed and retained. As of this update, that request hasn't been answered publicly. So here's where this specific thread actually leaves things. Not evidence of strangulation. Not a cleared, ruled-out possibility either. A genuine gap in the record, sitting exactly where the most sensitive question in this entire case happens to live, waiting on one office to share what it already has with the one pathologist the family trusted enough to fly their son's body across the country to see. Here's something that might surprise you. Mitchell's independent exam didn't include a toxicology screening at all, and the state's own toxicology, the results everyone has been waiting weeks for, still hasn't come back either. Two separate examinations, run by two separate offices, using two separate labs, and both of them are currently stuck on the exact same missing piece. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against a theory that's been floating around this case for a while now. The idea that one side is dragging its feet while the other moves fast. That's not what's actually happening. Both tracks appear genuinely stalled at the same bottleneck, a step neither office can simply speed up on demand, no matter how much public pressure keeps building around this case. So why does toxicology matter this much? Here's the part that doesn't get explained often enough. Drowning causes fluid to build up in the lungs. That's a real, physical, measurable thing a pathologist can see. The problem is a drug overdose can cause almost the exact same fluid buildup through a similar breakdown in how the body handles oxygen. Looking at the lungs alone, under a microscope, during a standard exam, often can't tell the two apart. That's why in forensic pathology, drowning is frequently described as a diagnosis of exclusion. Nobody confirms it outright by looking at the lungs. They rule out the alternatives first, especially an overdose, and only once those alternatives are eliminated does drowning become the remaining, supported explanation. Toxicology is the actual tool that does that ruling out, and it can take 6 to 8 weeks to come back. There's a detail worth understanding about what happens physically during an actual drowning, too, because it explains just how tangled this specific question gets. A person drowning is often swallowing water at the same time they're inhaling it, sometimes bringing some back up, then swallowing again. That can leave water in places like the stomach, something examiners sometimes look for, though it isn't always reliably present. But none of that solves the core problem. The lung findings themselves, the fluid buildup that signals the body was failing to breathe, look essentially the same whether the cause was water or something else entirely. There's a separate, entirely non-medical piece of this puzzle worth bringing in here, because it comes from someone who actually knows that stretch of water firsthand. A searcher with the United Cajun Navy, one of the volunteer teams involved in recovering Nolan's body, has described the specific area off Horn Island's northwestern shore in detail. He said the current there is dangerous enough that people who work that water regularly have their own name for it. They call it the washing machine because it rolls and churns in a way that can pull someone under fast and without warning. He was specific about the depth, too. In that exact stretch, the bottom can shift from 2 or 3 feet to nearly 20 feet within just a couple of steps. That detail matters for a reason that goes beyond just describing the danger. It offers a concrete, physical explanation for something that's bothered a lot of people following this case from the start. If Nolan was struggling in the water, how did nobody on a beach full of people notice? According to that same searcher, drowning doesn't usually look the way people expect. It's often quiet, not dramatic, especially when someone goes from standing safely in shallow water to being swept into a churning current in a matter of seconds. A visible, prolonged struggle isn't guaranteed, even in a crowd. Here's a scenario worth naming plainly, because it's more likely than either of the two extremes people tend to argue about. If toxicology eventually comes back showing some substance in Nolan's system, that wouldn't necessarily rule drowning out at all. Medically, a cause of death can be recorded as a combination, drowning as the direct physical cause, with a specific substance listed as a contributing factor. In that kind of finding, the manner of death would most likely still be classified as accidental, not homicide. That's a real, plausible middle outcome, genuinely different from either a clean, simple drowning or a confirmed case of foul play, and it's gotten far less public attention than the more dramatic possibilities. I want to be completely clear about one thing here. Nothing in this case, no official statement, no witness account, no piece of evidence made public so far, has suggested Nolan used any substance that day. This isn't being raised because there's evidence pointing toward it. It's being explained because it's part of the standard medical framework every examiner has to work through before ruling anything in or out, and understanding that framework is the only way to understand why a straightforward answer hasn't come yet. Which brings us back to where both investigations actually stand right now. Not stalled because anyone is hiding something, stalled because the one test capable of answering the question everyone actually wants answered, how did Nolan die, simply takes weeks, no matter who's asking or how loudly. At the press conference, Crump raised something that sounded, on its face, like a real contradiction. He said the United Cajun Navy told the family that Nolan was found face down and fully clothed. Then he pointed out the obvious problem with that. Every photo and video anyone has seen of Nolan that day shows him shirtless, in blue swim trunks. So if he was fully clothed when he was found, when exactly did that change? It's a fair question to ask out loud. It's also, once you actually trace where that phrase came from, more complicated than a simple contradiction. 2 days before that press conference, Todd Terrell, president of the United Cajun Navy, sat down for an interview and was asked directly whether Nolan was found fully clothed. He said yes, that's on record, in his own voice, before Crump ever repeated it. Then, hours after Crump's press conference, the organization's own account pushed back publicly. Not on Terrell's answer exactly, but on how it was being understood. They clarified that fully clothed, in this case, meant Nolan was wearing swim trunks, not that he'd somehow put a shirt back on. Terrell later confirmed that himself directly, adding that Nolan was found in the same general area where he likely went into the water in the first place, consistent, he said, with how bodies tend to behave in that specific stretch of current. So what actually happened here isn't Crump inventing a claim out of nothing, and it isn't the Cajun Navy contradicting themselves either. Not exactly. It's a word doing two different jobs. To most people, fully clothed means something specific, shirt included. To someone describing a body recovered from open water, it can just as easily mean not undressed, not stripped of what little he had on, still in his swim trunks rather than found bare. That distinction matters more than it might seem to on the surface, because it changes what question is actually still open here. If Nolan really had been found in more clothing than he was last seen wearing, that would suggest something happened between his last confirmed sighting and his body being recovered, a change nobody has explained. If he was found in exactly what he was last seen wearing, swim trunks and nothing else, then there's no real mystery left in this specific thread at all. Based on Terrell's own clarification, it's the second one. Nolan wasn't wearing more than he had on that afternoon. He was simply not naked when they found him. It's worth pausing on why a detail this narrow ended up amplified into something bigger during a national press conference. Crump is working from what people tell him, secondhand, filtered through however each person understood a specific word. That's not unique to him. It's true of nearly every account in this entire case, going all the way back to the very first contradiction anyone raised, whether Nolan said he was heading back to the boat or staying behind. Language carries assumptions people don't always notice they're making until someone else reads the same words completely differently. This particular thread resolved itself within hours, once the organization clarified what they'd actually meant. But it's a useful reminder for everything else still unresolved in this case. Not every apparent contradiction is two people lying to each other. Sometimes it's two people using the same word to mean two different things, and nobody catching the gap until it's already made headlines. Undetermined. That's still the only official word anyone has for how Nolan Wells died. But it isn't the same undetermined it was yesterday. There's a real physical finding now, a real documented gap in what could be examined, real institutional weight behind the demand for answers. None of that is a conclusion. All of it is progress, even if it doesn't feel like enough yet, especially not to a family still waiting almost 3 weeks in. Toxicology is still the piece everyone's waiting on both sides. When it comes back, we'll be here. If you've been following this case with us from the beginning, thank you for sticking with it through the parts that don't have clean answers yet. That's most of what real investigations actually look like. We'll be back the moment there's something real to bring you. Take care of each other out there.